The border station hung in the dark like a dead star. It was wide and flat and gray, built by people who had no interest in beauty and every interest in function. Dozens of ships moved around it slowly, careful and quiet, the way insects move around something they are not sure is sleeping. One of those ships was human. The Ardent Resolve was not the biggest ship in the convoy. It was not the most armed. But it was the one that carried Ambassador Sarah Voss, and that made it, in the opinion of most people who knew her, the most dangerous vessel in the area. Sarah Voss was 44 years old. She had short dark hair and gray eyes, and the kind of face that did not give much away. She had spent 20 years in diplomatic work. She had sat across the table from species that had no concept of mercy, species that communicated only through sound frequencies humans could not naturally hear, and species that had tried to eat the previous ambassador. She had handled all of them. She had handled them well. She was good at her job because she understood one thing clearly. Most problems, if you were patient enough, could be solved with words. Standing next to her in the docking corridor, holding her hand and looking at everything with enormous brown eyes, was her daughter Mira. Mira was 7 years old. She had her mother's dark hair, but her father's wide, curious face. She asked questions constantly. She had already asked 17 questions since the ship docked, including why the station smelled like metal, why the lights were purple instead of white, and whether the aliens had pets. "Do they have pets?" she asked again, pulling lightly on her mother's hand. "I don't think so," Sarah said. "Why not?" "Because they don't really think about other creatures the way we do." "That's sad," she decided. Sarah almost smiled. The Vrethkai were not a species that inspired warmth. They were tall and narrow, with smooth gray-green bodies and 4 arms, the top 2 used for fine work, the bottom 2 for heavy lifting or combat. Their faces were flat, with wide lidless eyes that reflected light like mirrors. They did not blink. They did not smile. They communicated in a clipped, precise language that had no word for comfort, and 17 words for efficiency. They had been part of the Galactic Concord for over 400 years. They were respected. They were powerful. They controlled 11 star systems and 14 colony worlds and one of the largest trade networks in the mid-galaxy. They were not liked, but they were not the kind of species you told that to. High Consul Zethara met the human delegation in the main reception hall. The hall was enormous and empty. There were no decorations. The Vrethkai did not consider sitting a neutral gesture. It signaled either exhaustion or submission, and they wanted neither. Sarah stood and did not let any of this bother her. Zethara looked at Mira for a long moment. "You brought a larva," it said. Its translator turned the words into flat, toneless standard, "to a diplomatic session." "My daughter travels with me when missions allow it," Sarah said. Her voice was calm and even. "She is well behaved and will not interfere with proceedings." Zethara's wide eyes moved back to Sarah. "Among our kind, larvae are kept in controlled facilities until they are useful. Bringing one to a function of significance is irregular." "Among our kind," Sarah replied, "our children are part of our lives. It is not irregular, it is normal." There was a pause. Zethara did not respond to this. It simply turned and began moving toward the far end of the hall, and the delegation followed. The talks that first day were procedural: trade routes, tariff structures, access rights to 3 contested asteroid belts that both human-aligned mining companies and Vrethkai operations had been circling for years. It was detailed work, the kind that required patience and precision, and Sarah was good at both. Mira sat in a side chair with a small reading tablet and did not complain once. On the second day, there was a station tour. It was Zethara's idea, a show of controlled openness, the kind of diplomatic gesture that meant very little, but looked good in reports. The delegation moved through the station in a group, guided by a junior Vrethkai official who spoke quickly and pointed at things without explaining them. There were many corridors. Mira, who had the attention span of a child and the curiosity of something much older, drifted. She did not mean to go far. She had seen a light, a soft blue glow coming from an open doorway down a side corridor, and had walked toward it the way all children walk toward interesting things without thinking about whether they should. The light was coming from a row of data terminals. They were tall and humming and casting blue light across the floor, in long rectangles. Mira stepped inside and looked at them. She did not hear the sentinel coming. It was not one of the guards assigned to the delegation. It was a station security unit, standard rotation, and it had a job: keep unauthorized personnel out of equipment bays. It saw a small creature in a restricted area. It did not ask questions. It did not give warnings. It raised the pain rod and used it. The sound Mira made was very small. She was unconscious before she hit the floor. Sarah heard nothing. She was 40 meters away, in a briefing room. The aide who found Mira was screaming before he reached the corridor intersection, and by the time Sarah got there, Mira was already being carried by 2 human medics from the ship's security team. Sarah looked at her daughter's face. She looked at the burns along Mira's arm and shoulder, where the rod had made contact. She looked at the way Mira's body was completely still, in a way that children's bodies should never be. She did not say anything for a very long time. Zethara arrived and explained the situation in the way the Vrethkai explained most things, directly, without apology, and with complete confidence that the explanation was sufficient. The child had entered a restricted area. The sentinel had followed protocol. There was no misconduct. There would be no punishment. A formal written notice of the incident would be filed, if the ambassador wished. Sarah looked at Zethara. She still did not say anything. One of the human aides stepped forward to speak, but Sarah raised one hand, and the aide stopped. "I understand," Sarah said. Her voice was very quiet, very flat. It had the quality of still water on a cold day, calm on top, and no way to know how deep it went. "Thank you for explaining." Zethara nodded once and left. Sarah walked to the side room where the medics had taken Mira. She sat down next to the medical cot. She took her daughter's small hand very carefully in both of hers. She looked at Mira's face for a long time. Then she took out her personal communicator and sent one encrypted message back to Earth. It contained 3 things: Mira's full medical scan, the identification code of the sentinel who had used the pain rod, and 5 words: "They touched my child." Then she put the communicator away. She smoothed Mira's hair back from her forehead. She sat very still. Outside, the Vrethkai continued their station routines. Ships docked and undocked. Data moved through terminals. Guards walked their rotations. None of them noticed the silence that had settled over the human wing of the station. None of them thought to wonder what it meant when a human stopped talking. They had spent 400 years in the Galactic Concord. They had studied dozens of species. They had never learned what human quiet actually sounded like. The message arrived on Earth at 0317 station time. It came through a priority military channel, the kind that bypassed normal diplomatic cues and landed directly in the hands of people who were trained to receive bad news without flinching. The duty officer who decoded it was a young lieutenant named Karis. She had been on shift for 6 hours. She had spent most of those hours reading routine reports and drinking cold coffee. She read the message once, then she read it again. Then she picked up the red handset on her desk, the one that had a very short list of people it could call, and she made the call. Within 4 minutes, Grand Admiral Tomas Rael was awake. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with white hair cut close to his head, and a face that looked like it had been carved out of something hard. He had commanded 3 wars, 2 of them before humanity had joined the Galactic Concord. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was, however, a man who understood exactly what 5 words from Sarah Voss meant. He read the message. He looked at Mira's medical scans. He looked at the burn pattern along a 7-year-old girl's arm and shoulder, and he sat with that for exactly 10 seconds. Then he got dressed and went to work. The Omega Council met 40 minutes later. The room they met in was deep underground, beneath the main United Human Command building in Geneva. It had no windows. The walls were soundproofed. The table was long, and the chairs around it were filled with 12 of the most senior military and government figures on Earth. Some of them had been asleep an hour ago. None of them looked tired now. Rael placed the message and the medical scans on the center of the table. He let everyone read. The room was very quiet. Then one of the council members, Defense Secretary Ilona Marsh, said, "How long has Wrath been in storage?" 31 years, Rael said. "Is it operational?" "We run diagnostics every 6 months. It has never failed one." Another silence. Then Marsh said, "Call the vote." The vote took 3 minutes. It was unanimous. Every hand went up without hesitation, without debate, without a single question about proportionality or diplomatic consequence. Rael noted this in his memory and said nothing about it. He had expected nothing less. There were certain things that, when placed on the table, required no argument. The harm of a child was one of them. Rael left the chamber and began making calls. What happened next, the rest of the galaxy did not see. They could not see it, because humanity had spent 40 years making very sure they wouldn't. When Earth had first joined the Galactic Concord, the senior diplomatic team had made a careful and deliberate choice. They would present humanity as capable but modest, willing but measured, a young species finding its place, asking questions, making friends, causing no trouble. It was not a lie, it was a portrait. And like all portraits, it showed only what the subject wanted you to see. The rest was kept very quiet, in the dark, behind locked doors, on moons and asteroids that did not appear on any Concord navigation chart. 700 breach-class warships came out of stealth in the space of 20 minutes. They had been sitting in low-power hibernation mode in the shadow of Earth's moon, in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and in 3 classified orbital facilities above the outer colonies. They were long and dark and angular, built for one purpose and shaped like that purpose. As they powered up, their running lights stayed off. There was no reason to advertise. On Titan, in a facility buried beneath 2 kilometers of ice and rock, a series of vault doors opened for the first time in 3 decades. Inside were the hunter-killer swarms, 10,000 autonomous combat drones per vault, each one roughly the size of a human fist, each one carrying enough focused energy to punch through 6 inches of military-grade hull plating. They were technically in violation of Concord weapons treaties. Technically. The relevant treaty specified production and deployment. It said nothing about storage. Human lawyers had read that treaty very carefully before it was signed. And then there was Wrath. Its full name was Wide-Range Automated Total Hostility Architecture. It had been built 22 years ago by a team of military AI engineers who had been asked a single question. If humanity ever needed to end a conflict completely, in the shortest possible time, with the minimum possible human casualties, what would that look like? Wrath was the answer. It was not a weapon system. It was not a battle AI in the way most people imagined. It did not fight. It calculated. It processed an enemy's entire military and governmental structure as a single system, identified every critical node, every power relay, every command channel, every fuel depot, every communication hub, and then removed them all in a sequence so precisely timed that the enemy's ability to respond collapsed before they understood what was happening. It did not overwhelm, it unraveled. It had been tested in simulations several thousand times. It had also never been used on a real target, because no one had ever wanted to see what it actually looked like when it ran. Rail authorized its activation at 0452 station time. Wrath came online in 11 seconds. It spent the next 4 minutes doing what it was built to do, learning. It pulled every piece of intelligence on the Vrethkai that human agencies had gathered over 40 years. Star maps, fleet positions, power grid layouts, government building schematics, communication relay locations, military patrol schedules. It processed all of it without comment. It built a complete picture of the Vrethkai Empire. All 12 billion of them, all 14 colony worlds, all 4,000 warships, all 612 orbital defense platforms. And it began to plan. It took Wrath 9 minutes to design the complete operation. It flagged one parameter for Rail's approval. The flag read, Civilian Population. Confirm exclusion from target set. Rail confirmed it without hesitation. Wrath updated its plan and returned a single line of output. Operation Pale Verdict, ready for execution on your order. On the other side of the galaxy, a Thelian diplomatic observer named Oros was sitting in his personal quarters aboard a Concord monitoring vessel when his long-range sensors picked up an unusual energy signature near Earth. He was not sure what he was looking at. He ran it through 3 different analysis programs. None of them had a classification for it. He sent an urgent message to his government. It read, "We are watching something mobilize near the human home system. I cannot tell you what it is. I can tell you it is large. I can tell you it is moving fast. And I can tell you that in 40 years of watching this species, I have never seen them move like this before." He paused before sending, then added one more line. "I think we were wrong about them. I think we have always been wrong about them. I am not sure what they actually are, but I do not think any of us ever took the time to find out." He sent the message. Then he turned back to his sensors and watched. The ships were already gone. They had moved so fast, his instruments had barely caught the edge of their drive signatures before the readings dropped back to 0. Humanity was not mobilizing anymore. Humanity was already on its way. The Vrethkai had a saying. It was very old, passed down through their warrior caste for centuries. It translated roughly as, "The enemy who does not announce himself has already lost, because only cowards strike without warning." They believed this completely. They were wrong. The first sign that something was happening came at 6:03 station time, when every single long-range communication relay in the Vrethkai Empire went dark at the same moment. Not slow, not one by one, all of them, simultaneously. Across 14 colony worlds in the home system, every deep space signal simply stopped. The Vrethkai communication officers who noticed it first assumed it was a technical fault. A cascade error in the relay network, perhaps. These things happened occasionally. They ran diagnostics. The diagnostics came back clean. The relays were not broken. Physically destroyed, every one of them, in a single coordinated strike, so fast and so precise that none of the relay stations had even sent a distress signal before they were hit. The Vrethkai did not yet understand what this meant. They began working the problem with the calm, methodical efficiency their culture demanded. They sent short-range signals to the nearest colony worlds. They received no answers. They increased power to their backup arrays. Nothing came back. The silence was total. On Vrethka Prime, High Consul Zethara was in a morning briefing when a communications aide entered the room and said very quietly that there appeared to be a problem with the outer relay network. Zethara asked if it was affecting military channels. The aide said, yes. Zethara set down the report it had been reading and asked how long the blackout had been active. 11 minutes, the aide said. Zethara stood up. It was still standing when the alarms began. The Vrethkai Planetary Defense Grid was one of the oldest and most heavily funded military systems in the mid-galaxy. It had 612 orbital platforms, each one carrying long-range detection arrays and enough firepower to stop a small fleet cold. The detection range was enormous. Any ship approaching the system would be picked up well beyond the outer planets, giving the defense grid more than enough time to respond. The human fleet did not approach from the outer planets. It arrived directly above them. Wrath had spent 9 minutes calculating the precise coordinates for every ship in the fleet. Not coordinates at the edge of the system, not coordinates outside weapons range. Coordinates inside the defense perimeter, above the atmosphere, already past every line the Vrethkai had built. Human FTL technology had been quietly refined for 20 years in classified programs that had never been shared with the Concord. It was not faster than Vrethkai drives. It was more accurate, precise to within meters at interstellar distances. 700 breach-class warships appeared in Vrethkai space, like a door opening in the middle of a room that was supposed to have no doors. The defense grid opened fire immediately. It was a powerful and well-trained system, and it did exactly what it was built to do. Targeting locks engaged in under 2 seconds. Weapons charged and fired. It was, by any normal standard, an impressive response. Wrath had already accounted for it. Every firing solution the defense grid produced was based on where the human ships had been when the locks engaged. By the time the shots arrived, the ships were somewhere else. Not far. Just enough. Wrath moved each vessel with small, continuous corrections, staying one calculation ahead of the grid's targeting system at all times. The way a person steps around puddles on a familiar road without ever breaking stride. Meanwhile, the hunter-killer swarms were already moving. 10,000 drones per wave, launched in tight formation from the breach-class ships, spreading outward through the orbital space above Vrethka Prime, like water moving across a flat surface. Each drone had a target list. Each drone had a flight path. None of them deviated. They hit the orbital defense platforms from below, from the angles the platforms were not designed to cover, and they hit them all within a window of 40 seconds. 612 platforms. 40 seconds. Then the swarms turned toward the surface. They did not target population centers. Wrath had been very clear about this, and it did not need to be told twice. What it targeted instead were the things that held power together. The military command buildings, the government communication towers, the underground bunkers where the Vrethkai High Fleet received its orders, the fuel processing stations that kept warships moving, the energy relay hubs that connected the planetary grid. Each target was precise. Each strike was clean. There was no excess. Wrath did not waste anything. It removed exactly what it needed to remove, and nothing else. Across Vrethka Prime, lights went out in a sequence. District by district, sector by sector, the power grid failed in the exact order Wrath had calculated would cause the most rapid collapse of government and military function. Cities did not burn. Buildings did not fall. The lights simply went off, and the machinery of the Vrethkai state stopped running. At 0714 station time, Zathara managed to open a channel to the human fleet. It did not know who it was reaching. It simply transmitted on every available frequency until something answered. Grand Admiral Rail appeared on screen. He was sitting in the command chair of the Ardent Resolve, which had rejoined the fleet after leaving the border station. He looked calm. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the way a person looks when they are doing a job they are very familiar with. Zathara said, "What is the meaning of this? We demand to know your terms. What are your conditions for stopping?" Rail looked at Zathara for a moment. He said, "We don't have any." Zathara's lidless eyes were very still. Every civilized species presents terms. Every conflict has conditions. What do you want? Rail said, We wanted you to not hurt a child. You did, so now we're here. He paused. There's nothing to negotiate. Zethara opened its mouth to respond, and the channel dropped. Not because Rail cut it. Because the communication tower, relaying the signal, was destroyed 30 seconds into the conversation, right on Rack's schedule. The Vrethkai High Fleet scrambled. 4,000 warships was not a small force. They were well-trained and well-armed, and they moved fast, forming defensive lines around the home planet and pushing attack formations toward the human ships. Under normal circumstances, against any other opponent, it would have been a serious fight. The kind that could last months. The kind that could cost thousands of lives on both sides. Wrath did not fight the way other systems fought. It did not match ship against ship. It looked at the fleet as a machine, and found the parts the machine could not work without. Fuel ships, carrier command vessels, the 6 flagship vessels that carried the admirals who gave orders to the rest. It removed them first, in the first 4 minutes, before the Vrethkai had fully formed their battle lines. Without those vessels, the fleet's coordination began to break down. Wrath watched the breakdown happen, and continued pulling threads. By hour 3, the Vrethkai High Fleet had been reduced from 4,000 ships to less than 200. The survivors were drifting. Some were venting atmosphere. Some had simply powered down, their crews having made the very human-like decision that continuing to fight was pointless. The home planet was dark and quiet. A low-caste scholar named Velshar, who worked in the government archive district and had no military rank and no political power, and had spent his entire life cataloging records that no one read, sat in his office in the dark and listened to the silence. He had a small emergency power cell that kept his personal terminal running. He used it to write. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about what the Vrethkai had believed about themselves, and about what they had believed about humans. He wrote about the child, and about what his government had said when it happened, and about what he had thought privately but never said out loud. He finished writing and read it back once. Then he placed the data chip into a small emergency survival pod, the kind kept in archive buildings in case of fire, and he launched it into orbit. He did not know if anyone would ever find it. He sent it anyway. Outside, Vrethka Prime was very dark and very still. The last sunrise it would ever see under its own government was already over. The Galactic Concord emergency session was called at 0745 station time. It was the fastest an emergency session had ever been called in the Concord's 400-year history. The previous record had been set during the Drovani border crisis of 2201, when 2 species had nearly gone to war over a disputed moon. That session had taken 3 hours to convene. This one took 19 minutes, because every ambassador and senior delegate in the Concord had already been awake, already sitting in front of their screens, already watching the readings coming out of Vrethkai space, with the kind of focused, unblinking attention that living things give to things that frighten them. The session chamber was a vast circular room aboard the Concord's flagship, the Eternal Accord. It had seating for over 200 delegates. Every seat was filled. The room was designed so that no species sat higher than any other. A deliberate architectural choice meant to reinforce the Concord's founding principle that all member civilizations were equal. For the first 40 minutes of the session, no one said a single word. This had also never happened before. The Keth ambassador, a being so old that its species had been members of the Concord since before humanity had discovered fire, sat in its designated place and looked at the central display screen. The display was showing a real-time map of Vrethkai space. The symbols representing Vrethkai military assets were going out one by one, like small flames being pinched off by invisible fingers. The Keth ambassador watched this and said nothing. It had seen wars before. It had seen empires fall before. It had never seen either happen this fast. And it was old enough to know that the correct response to something you did not fully understand was silence. The Drovan ambassador, Hasila, was not as old as the Keth, but she had been in diplomatic service for 30 years, and she understood politics the way a carpenter understands wood, by feeling it, by knowing where the grain ran and where it was likely to split. She was watching the screen too, but she was also watching the other delegates. She was watching their faces, or the parts of their bodies that served the same purpose as faces. She was watching how still they had all gone. She had been present at the border station 2 days ago. She had been in the corridor when the aide came running. She had seen Mira being carried out. She had seen Sarah Voss's face in the moment after. She had filed no complaint, raised no concern, sent no message to her government or to the Concord Oversight Committee. She had told herself it was not her place. She had told herself the humans would handle it through proper channels. She sat now in the session chamber and looked at the map and thought about what proper channels look like when a 7-year-old girl had burn marks along her arm. At 0831, one of the junior Vrethkai diplomatic staff who had been on the border station managed to reach the Concord on an emergency frequency. He was not a senior official. He had no authority to speak for his government, but there was no one else left with functioning communications, so he spoke anyway. His message was short. He said that Vrethka Prime had lost all power. He said the fleet was gone. He said he did not know if High Consul Zethara was still alive. He said he did not know what to do. The chamber listened to this transmission in complete silence. Then the Peloran ambassador, a round, pale being with 6 eyes, who represented one of the oldest trading civilizations in the Concord, said very quietly, "Should we intervene?" No one answered him. He looked around the room. 200 delegates, representing species that collectively controlled most of the known galaxy, and not one of them moved to answer his question. Some looked at the floor. Some looked at the screen. Some looked at the human's empty seat at the table. Ambassador Voss had not attended the session, for obvious reasons, as if the chair itself might explain something. The Peloran ambassador did not ask again. Hasila stood up. The room turned to look at her. She did not have a prepared statement, but she had been carrying something since the corridor of the border station, and it had gotten heavy enough that she could not hold it quietly anymore. She said, "I was there, at the station. I saw the child after it happened. I saw what was done to her." She paused. "I also saw how Zethara responded. I saw the complete absence of regret. I heard the explanation, that it was protocol, that it was justified, that there was nothing to apologize for." She stopped again, looked at the screen. "And I said nothing. I filed nothing. I thought it was not my business." She looked back at the room. "I am not saying the humans were wrong to respond. I am saying we were wrong to be silent, and I think we should be honest about that, even if we are not brave enough to say it out loud to anyone outside this room." The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. No resolution was proposed. No formal statement was drafted. No vote was called. The session simply continued. Delegate after delegate, sitting with what Hasila had said, turning it over, not knowing where to put it. Meanwhile, at the border station, in a small medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, Mira was awake. She had woken up an hour ago. The medics had explained to her, in the simple and careful way that people explain things to children, that she had been hurt, but that she was going to be fine. Mira had listened to this, and then asked for her mother. And Sarah had come immediately, still in the same clothes she had been wearing for 2 days, her hair pulled back roughly, her eyes carrying the particular kind of tiredness that is not about sleep. Mira looked at her mother's face for a moment. "Your hands are shaking," Mira said. Sarah looked down. She pressed her hands flat against the edge of the medical cot. "I'm just tired," she said. Mira accepted this with the trusting ease of a child who believed her mother completely. And Sarah was grateful for it in a way she could not put into words. A junior aide appeared in the doorway. He caught Sarah's eye and gave a small, single nod. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to Mira. The operation was in its final phase. She did not tell Mira this. She smoothed her daughter's blanket. She asked if Mira was hungry. Mira said yes, and also that she wanted to know if they could go home soon, because she missed the dog. Sarah laughed at that. It was a small, surprise laugh, the kind that comes out when you are not expecting to feel anything gentle, and then something gentle arrived anyway. "Soon," Sarah said. "We'll go home soon." Back in Vrethkai space, a small survival pod was drifting in low orbit above the darkened home planet. It had been in orbit for just under 2 hours. A human scout vessel, running a sweep of the area for survivors, picked up its signal. The crew brought it aboard and found the data chip inside. The ranking officer on the Scout, a lieutenant named Bren, read what was on the chip. Then she sat with it for a while. Then she forwarded up the chain with a personal note that said simply, "Someone should read this." The person who wrote it understood something. I think we should know that not all of them were the same. At 9:47 station time, Wrath transmitted its final status report to Grand Admiral Rail. It was 6 lines long. The last line said, "Awaiting further orders." Rail read it at his desk. He read the last line twice. He thought about Mira's medical scans. He thought about a 7-year-old girl asking to go home because she missed the dog. He thought about Velshar, whose name he did not know yet, sitting alone in a dark office, writing something true and sending it into the dark, and not knowing if it would reach anyone. He typed 2 words, "Stand down." Then he typed 4 more, "Send in the aid ships." He sent it and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Outside the window of his office, the stars were very still. The first human aid ship arrived at Vrethka Prime 18 hours after the last defense platform went dark. It was not a warship. It was wide and slow and white, with large red markings on its hull that every species in the Galactic Concord recognized as the universal symbol for medical relief. It entered Vrethkai orbit without weapons charged and without an escort, broadcasting its identity and its purpose on every open frequency. It carried food processors, water purification units, portable power generators, and enough medical supplies to treat roughly 40,000 people. Behind it came 11 more ships, exactly like it. The Vrethkai civilians who watched them descend through the atmosphere did not know what to do with this. Their government had told them, for as long as any of them could remember, that humans were an unstable and emotional species, prone to irrational behavior, and not to be taken seriously as a military or political force. Their government had also just been erased in under 6 hours by those same humans. And now, those humans were landing in their cities and setting up food stations and treating injured people and asking through translators whether anyone needed help. There was no cultural framework in Vrethkai society for any of this. They understood conquest, they understood occupation, they understood tribute and turns, and the formal transfer of power from the defeated to the victor. What they did not understand was an enemy who destroyed your army in the morning and fed your children in the afternoon. Many of them simply stood at a distance and watched the humans work, trying to fit what they were seeing into a shape that made sense. It did not fit. A Vrethkai civilian named Torva, who had worked as a food distribution clerk before the power grid went down, watched a human medic treat an elderly Vrethkai woman who had been injured when a communication tower collapsed near her home. The medic was young, probably no more than 25 by human standards, with red hair and an expression of focused concentration. She worked carefully. She explained each step to the woman she was treating, even though she knew the woman probably could not understand her words. She spoke anyway, in a soft and steady voice, because she thought it might be comforting. Torva watched this for a long time. Then she walked over and asked the medic's translator unit whether the humans were going to stay and take control of the planet. The medic looked up. She thought about how to answer. Then she said, "We're going to stay until you don't need us anymore. After that, it's up to your people to decide what you want." Torva did not respond. She stood there for a moment longer, and then walked away. But she came back 2 hours later and asked if she could help carry supplies. The medic said yes. In the Galactic Concorde, the silence that had filled the emergency session chamber slowly gave way to something else. Not debate exactly. More like a long, uncomfortable conversation that no one had planned to have, and no one quite knew how to finish. Delegates talked to each other in small groups, in corridors and private meeting rooms. In the careful and indirect way that politicians discuss things they are not ready to say officially. The thing they kept coming back to was simple. Humanity had done something that none of them had believed was possible, and then had done something else that none of them had expected at all. The destruction, that part they could have predicted if they had known what humanity was actually carrying. The speed was shocking, and the precision was something several military analysts spent weeks trying to fully understand. But the act of war itself was within the range of things they had a category for. Species fought. Empires fell. It was not new. The aid ships were new. No species in Concorde history had ever responded to a conflict by immediately turning around and caring for the people they had just defeated. There were theories about why humans had done it. Some delegates believed it was a political move, a way of avoiding long-term instability in the region. Some believed it was a show of power, a way of saying we could have done far worse and chose not to. Some believed it was neither of those things. Some believed it was exactly what it looked like, which was a species that had been furious and had acted on that fury, and then, the moment the threat was gone, had no interest in causing any more harm than necessary. Hesila believed the last one. She did not say this publicly, but she wrote it in a private report to her government, and she added one more line at the end. We should think carefully about what kind of species we want humanity to be toward us when we are the ones in need, because they will remember how we behave today. Her government read the report and did not respond to it officially, but 3 weeks later, they quietly submitted a formal proposal to the Concorde Oversight Committee, requesting a review of all past incidents involving civilian harm at Vrethkai-controlled border facilities. The proposal passed with 31 votes. There were no votes against it. There were 14 abstentions, all from species who had their own records they were hoping no one would look at too closely. Velshar's data chip was translated and published 6 weeks after the conflict ended. It spread through the Concorde information networks faster than anything diplomatic or military in recent memory. Most beings read it the way people read something that confirms a feeling they already had but could not find words for. Velshar had not written it as a political document. He had written it as one person trying to understand what had gone wrong, and that honesty came through in every line. The last paragraph was quoted in 7 different Concorde languages within the first month. It said, "We thought their love for their young was a weakness because it made them feel things deeply. We were wrong. It was not weakness. It was the one thing they would never negotiate away. And we walked into it with both eyes open and called it justified." Velshar himself was found alive 3 weeks after the conflict. He had been living in his office on emergency rations, continuing to write because he did not know what else to do. When a human recovery team found him and told him that his data chip had been read by several billion beings across the Concorde, he sat very quietly for a moment. Then he asked if his archive was still intact. It was. But for the first time in his career, people were reading them. Mira went home to Earth 12 days after she had woken up in the medical bay, asking about the dog. The dog was waiting at the door when they arrived. His name was Biscuit. He was large and tan, and completely unaware that anything unusual had happened, which Mira found deeply comforting. She sat on the floor with him for a long time, while her mother stood in the doorway of the house and looked at the afternoon light coming through the window. Mira asked, while Biscuit was attempting to sit in her lap, despite being much too large to do so, whether the bad aliens were really gone. Sarah thought about how to answer that for a moment. She said, "Their government is gone. The people are still there. We're helping them now." Mira looked up. "Why are we helping them if they hurt me?" Sarah came and sat on the floor beside her daughter. She thought about Rael typing 4 words into a terminal. She thought about the medic with red hair working carefully in a darkened city. She thought about Velshar, alone in a dark office, writing something true and sending it into the dark. She said, because hurting people who can't fight back is exactly the thing we were angry about. So we can't do it either. Mira thought about this the way she thought about most hard things, which was slowly and seriously and without pretending it was simpler than it was. "That makes sense," she said finally, "but it's still complicated." "Yes," Sarah said, "it is." Biscuit licked Mira's face. Mira laughed. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the floor as the sun shifted, slow and golden and completely ordinary, the way the light on Earth always was. Grand Admiral Thomas Rael appeared before the Omega Council one final time 3 months after the conflict ended. He submitted a formal motion to return Wrath to sealed storage. It passed without discussion. He then submitted one amendment to Wrath's activation protocol. The amendment added a single new condition that had to be met before the system could ever be authorized for deployment again. The amendment was classified at the highest level. It was known to exist, but its exact wording was never officially released. One council member who had been present that day wrote about it years later in her private memoirs. She said the room had been very quiet when Rael read it aloud. She said several people who had spent their careers making hard decisions in cold rooms with no windows had looked, for just a moment, like they were thinking about someone they loved. The amendment read, "Before this system is ever used again, ask one question. Ask whether what happened to cause this could have been prevented by a single act of basic decency. If the answer is yes, then remember that we are not doing this because we are powerful. We are doing this because we made a promise a long time ago without ever saying it out loud to every child born into this species. The promise was simple. It was this: no one touches you and walks away whole. No one. Not ever. Not while a single one of us is still standing. That is not a threat. That is just who we are."